He was just a quiet small-town teacher nobody remembered. 25 years later, his former students discovered the truth. In the small town of Mill Haven, Tennessee, there was a middle school teacher nobody paid much attention to. His name was Gerald Hayes, and for 31 years, he taught 7th grade English in the same classroom, at the same desk, wearing the same rotation of plain-collared shirts. He drove an old blue pickup truck, ate his lunch alone at his desk, and rarely raised his voice above a gentle calm. Parents saw him as forgettable. The school board saw him as unremarkable. Most students, by the time they reached high school, could barely remember his name. But Gerald Hayes was hiding something. And it would take 25 years and a shoebox found in the back of a storage closet for anyone to find out what it was. Gerald had grown up poor. His father was a mill worker. His mother cleaned houses 3 towns over. College had felt like a distant dream until a teacher, a woman named Mrs. Patton, had quietly pulled him aside one afternoon in 8th grade and handed him a book, a worn paperback copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, with a note tucked inside the front cover. The note read simply, "You have a mind worth using, Gerald. Don't waste it." He never forgot that. He went on to study English literature on a scholarship, and when he graduated, he turned down a better-paying job in the city to return to Mill Haven. He wanted to be what Mrs. Patton had been for him. For 3 decades, few people understood why a man of his intelligence stayed in a small, underfunded school in a town most people left as soon as they could. His colleagues assumed he lacked ambition. Some parents assumed he lacked options. Gerald never corrected anyone. He simply kept teaching. What no one knew was that Gerald had a quiet system he'd run for over 25 years. Every year, he watched his students carefully. Not for their grades, not for their test scores, but for the ones who looked the way he had once looked. Tired eyes, worn shoes. Lunches that were smaller than they should have been. Library books that were clearly being read by lamplight long after everyone else at home had gone to sleep. The ones who were quietly hungry, not just for food, but for something more. When he found those students, he said nothing to them directly. Instead, he worked in the background. He paid for school supplies out of his own pocket, leaving them anonymously in the classroom supply bin. He quietly covered the cost of field trips for students whose parents had sent in notes saying they couldn't afford to go. He ordered extra copies of books he knew certain students would love, leaving them in the lost and found with the student's name written lightly in pencil inside the cover, just faintly enough to be plausibly accidental. He nominated students for scholarships they didn't know existed, writing recommendation letters so detailed and so passionate that college admissions officers later said they were unlike anything they had ever read. He never told the students he had done it. Gerald lived simply. He never married, never traveled, never renovated the small house he'd inherited from his parents. His salary, modest as it was, went largely into what he privately called his system. He had no name for it beyond that. It was simply what he did. He retired quietly at 67 with a small cake in the teacher's lounge and a card signed by the staff. No ceremony, no standing ovation. He drove home in the old blue pickup, sat on his porch, and felt at peace. He passed away 2 years later in his sleep, leaving behind no spouse and no children. His only relative, a nephew named David who lived 3 states away, came to handle the estate. The house was nearly empty of anything valuable. Gerald had owned almost nothing of consequence. But in the back of the storage closet, David found a shoebox. Inside were no valuables, no cash, no secret fortune. Just paper. Hundreds of folded notes, letters, and printouts, each carefully organized by year, going back over 2.5 decades. They were records. Every student Gerald had quietly helped, every scholarship he'd written for, every anonymous supply purchase, Every book he'd slipped into a lost and found. Every field trip he'd covered. Every letter he'd sent on behalf of a student who never knew he'd written it. Beside each entry, in Gerald's careful handwriting, was a short note about the student. Not their grades, not their test scores, just a sentence or two about who they were. Marcus reads everything he can get his hands on. Reminds me of myself at 12. Has a shot if someone just opens the door a little. Celia wants to be a nurse. Works at the gas station after school to help her mum. Don't let her fall through the cracks. There were 217 names in that shoebox. A local journalist picked up the story, then a regional paper, then a national outlet. Within a month, Millhaven found itself at the center of something unexpected. Former students who had gone on to build careers, start businesses, and raise families began returning to town, not for a ceremony, not for a photo opportunity, but simply to stand in the empty classroom where Gerald had taught for 31 years and feel, perhaps for the first time, the full weight of what had happened there. They established a scholarship fund in his name, seeded with donations from the 217 people in that shoebox, and dozens more who had simply heard the story and wanted to be part of it. The Gerald Hayes Memorial Scholarship for students in Millhaven who show quiet potential and need someone to open the door. The old blue pickup truck was donated to the school. It sits in the parking lot still with a small plaque on the dashboard. It reads, "You have a mind worth using. Don't waste it." The words Mrs. Patton had written to a poor mill worker's son 60 years earlier in the front of a worn paperback book had traveled further than anyone could have imagined. Gerald Hayes had made sure of that. If you enjoyed this story, please leave a like and subscribe. And don't forget to check out the other story that may be appearing on your screen right now. It will most likely move you just as much. Have a beautiful day, and we'll see you in the next one.